For years, the United States was seen as the dominant force in the region, shaping events through military pressure, economic sanctions, and political influence. But from Iran's perspective, that balance has now changed. After what I describe as the 40-day war, the Islamic Republic of Iran managed to defeat the United States not only on the battlefield, but also in the broader campaign of pressure and siege warfare. Despite years of sanctions, isolation, and constant threats, Iran remained standing, and in my view, forced Washington to accept a memorandum of understanding that clearly favored Tehran's position. Whether people agree with that assessment or not, the reality is that such developments have shifted the regional balance of power. Countries and movements that once believed they had little room to act are now beginning to see that the political landscape is no longer the same. The era in which the United States could impose its will without meaningful resistance is, in my opinion, coming to an end, and that change is already beginning to influence decisions across the Middle East. One of the clearest examples of this shift can be seen in Yemen. After these developments, Iran decided to send a commercial aircraft to Sana'a. This was not a military mission or a show of force. It was a civilian aircraft carrying a political message as much as anything else. The purpose was to challenge the long-running siege imposed on Yemen, a blockade that, from the Iranian point of view, is both illegal and deeply immoral because it primarily harms ordinary civilians rather than military targets. Hospitals struggle to receive medicine, families face shortages of food and basic supplies, and countless innocent people continue to suffer because of restrictions that have lasted for years. Iran's decision to send the aircraft was intended to demonstrate that such a siege should no longer be accepted as normal. During the first attempt, Saudi Arabia made what I believe was a serious mistake by scrambling fighter jets to intercept the plane. In the end, those aircraft were forced to withdraw, and that incident itself reflected a changing strategic reality. It suggested that the old assumptions about absolute military dominance were no longer as certain as they once appeared. The second attempt, however, took an even more dramatic turn. As the Iranian commercial aircraft was preparing to land in Sana'a, Saudi forces chose a different response. Instead of relying on fighter jets to prevent the landing, they bombed the airport itself. That single decision changed the situation completely. It was no longer simply about stopping an airplane. It became a symbol of the lengths to which those enforcing the siege were willing to go in order to keep Yemen isolated. From my perspective, attacking an airport to prevent a civilian aircraft from landing only reinforces the argument that the blockade is not about security alone, but about maintaining pressure on an entire population. Such actions inevitably deepen resentment among Yemenis and strengthen their determination to resist rather than submit. For the Yemeni people, there comes a point when patience runs out. No nation can be expected to live indefinitely under a blockade that limits access to food, medicine, fuel, and other basic necessities. The people of Yemen have endured years of hardship, and I believe they have now reached the conclusion that they will no longer tolerate this situation. More importantly, the broader regional environment has changed in ways that give them greater confidence. As the balance of power moves away from the United States and its allies, countries and resistance movements that were once forced into defensive positions now see an opportunity to exercise greater control over their own affairs. Yemen in particular is increasingly determined to defend its sovereignty and reject policies imposed from outside. In my view, this is not an isolated event, but part of a much larger transformation taking place across the region. The old order is weakening, and new realities are beginning to emerge as nations insist on making their own decisions instead of accepting foreign pressure. I believe what we are witnessing is only the beginning of a much broader transformation. For decades, the United States was able to project power across the Middle East with relatively little resistance. Many governments adjusted their policies according to Washington's preferences because they believed there was no realistic alternative. That perception, however, is beginning to fade. When regional actors realize that even the world's most powerful military can be challenged, their calculations naturally change. They become more willing to defend their own interests and less willing to accept decisions imposed from outside. This shift is not happening overnight, but the momentum is clearly moving in that direction. The influence that the American-led order once enjoyed is no longer as unquestioned as it was in previous decades. That is why I say the empire no longer possesses the authority it once had. Authority is not simply about military strength or economic power. It also depends on credibility and the belief that others will ultimately accept your leadership. Once that belief begins to disappear, influence declines even if military capabilities remain significant. Across the region, more countries and movements are becoming convinced that they have greater room to pursue independent policies without automatically yielding to outside pressure. Yemen is one example of this changing mindset, but it is far from the only one. As confidence grows among regional actors, we are likely to see more governments and resistance movements challenging policies they previously felt powerless to resist. In my view, this changing political environment represents one of the most important consequences of the recent conflict, because it signals that the balance of power is no longer defined solely by American influence, but increasingly by the determination of regional nations to shape their own future. The recent confrontation with Iran has only reinforced that perception. Over the last few days, the United States launched what it believed would be a decisive assault. expecting that overwhelming military pressure would force Iran into a weaker position. Instead, the outcome has been very different from what many had anticipated. From my perspective, Washington failed to achieve its strategic objectives, while Iran's response proved both effective and damaging. The Iranian counterstrikes demonstrated that Iran possesses the capability and the willingness to respond directly rather than simply absorb pressure. This is an important message not only for the United States but for every country in the region. It shows that military superiority alone does not guarantee political success, especially when the opposing side is prepared for a prolonged confrontation and has developed the means to impose significant costs in return. These developments inevitably influence the calculations of other regional players. Nations and movements carefully watch the outcome of such confrontations because they shape future expectations. If they conclude that the United States can no longer achieve its objectives through force alone, they become more confident in defending their own interests. That confidence is particularly significant for Yemen. For years, Yemen has faced enormous pressure while trying to preserve its sovereignty under extremely difficult conditions. Now, with the regional balance gradually shifting, the Yemeni leadership has greater reason to believe that it can challenge the policies that have isolated the country. This is why I argue that the events surrounding the airport and the blockade are not isolated incidents. They are connected to a much larger strategic picture in which the political and military realities of the Middle East are being reshaped before our eyes, and those changes are creating opportunities that simply did not exist a few years ago. For that reason, I believe this moment should not be viewed as a single incident involving one airport or one commercial flight. It represents a turning point that reflects a much broader shift in regional politics. The attempt to break the siege on Yemen, the response from Saudi Arabia, and the growing confidence of countries that refuse to accept outside pressure are all connected. In my view, the balance of power is moving in a different direction, and that change will have consequences far beyond Yemen itself. As American influence weakens and regional actors become more willing to defend their sovereignty, we are likely to witness new political realities emerge across the Middle East. The old assumptions that shaped the region for decades are increasingly being challenged, and governments can no longer assume that previous methods of pressure will always produce the same results. From my perspective, the events of recent weeks illustrate that the region is entering a new phase. The United States and its allies still possess considerable military and economic capabilities, but power is no longer measured only by size or resources. It is also measured by whether those tools achieve their intended political goals. When resistance continues despite sanctions, military campaigns, and prolonged sieges, it becomes clear that the regional equation is changing. Yemen's determination to resist the blockade is one example of that wider transformation. I believe we are witnessing the beginning of a new balance of power, in which countries and movements across the region will increasingly insist on making their own decisions and defending their own sovereignty. Whether others agree with that assessment or not, the developments we have seen suggest that the Middle East is entering a period where the political landscape will no longer be shaped in the same way it was for decades, and the consequences of that shift are only beginning to unfold.